Hi, everyone. This is Billy LaGuardia. I'm a New York-based recording engineer, and this is part 2 of the mixing a live recording. So in part 1, we dealt with just some light setup of the session, just a couple of compressors and some reverbs and things. In this section, we're going to look at the drum kit. So just pop over to my other screen here. Solar drum bus. So in Nuendo, which is a little different than Pro Tools, and in the sense that when you create a group, our group nomenclature is not necessarily a bank of faders in their specific position. A group is more of an aux track or a bus if you're trying to look at what I'm doing in a comparable thing to Pro Tools. So I have my groups set up into a kick group, a snare group, a toms group. I call this a metal group, which is really just cymbals, and then my master drum group. So if you notice, if I click my toms group, because I'm going to listen to the toms and it's also inclusive of the master drum group, it will also solo. So let's listen to our drum kit. I like to start with the kick drum, so let's give that a listen. So with the kick drum, I have the natural kick drum, and then I also have a trigger that I like to use. I like to blend the two together. I would rather use the natural drum sound. I use triggering in drums in two specific ways. One, if it's a live recording and there's a lot of bleed in one thing that I didn't necessarily think about, like I've done live recordings where the bass amp is right next to the kick drum and I can't do anything with the kick drum because there's so much bass guitar bleed in there that I had to use it for a sample. But most of the time I use a sample just to keep the hits a little bit more consistent. I don't like to use a polyphonic sample. I like to just use a mono sample. So that it's on or it's off. There aren't degrees of a hit. It's either just on or it's off. If I'm adding a trigger or a sample to a natural instrument and I want to keep it natural, I'm really just using it to give consistency. And the other thing that I like to do is I like to use it to drive my effects. So most of the time, like for the snare drum example, as an example, you're not necessarily hearing the reverb driving on the snare channel. I would rather that the trigger samples the reverb, just because the trigger is a very consistent hit. So it's triggering the reverb in a very specific way. And if you watched part 1, I like to have my reverb set up as 100% wet, so that what's hitting my return fader is just a wet sound. It's not really the dry sound is coming out of the our channel fader, and the wet sound is coming out of our master return. This gives you a nice little parallel thing, so that you have wet and dry, and you can blend wet and dry together. So I would rather use my trigger, my sample, to drive a reverb than the actual snare drum, because the cool thing about a really good drummer, which this session is blessed with a great drummer, one of my favorite drummers in New York. He hits the drums very hard and very consistently. So it's not really as applicable for him because he's a good musician. But some drummers that hit the drum kind of all over the place, you'll get a nice dead center hit, and then you'll get some perimeter hits. The triggers really help clean that up in terms of what's driving your effect sense. So let's listen to the kick in. So I'm just going to solo this. So the drum we used was a Yamaha stage custom kit with a fair amount of deadening in the drum. It was an Audix D6 was the kick drum mic, and it was going into a Focusrite Octobri. Cool. So this is a nice sounding drum. So we'll notice our PAZ analyzer is telling us that this particular drum is hitting right around 60 hertz, which is where I want it to be. I like kick drums that live in that 60 hertz frequency. Let's clear our memory and just confirm that. Okay, I'm lying to you. we're hitting in hitting at about 100 hertz. Okay. So the first thing that tells me, not that I'm very much of a numbers guy with this kind of thing, but what that tells me is bass guitars live in 100 hertz. Bass players like 100 hertz, and most bass amps are set up so that the bass boost with a nice Baxendale EQ curve on most instrument amplifiers are boosting about 100. So we want to make sure that we're not going to be living in that frequency. So let's start by this. Let's pull up a channel strip. This is an SSL E-series channel strip in mono. I have it set up in just my normal kick drum preset just for the sake of time, but let's listen to